I want to thank everybody for joining us on a Friday, almost afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started with this public hearing for the fiscal year 2026-2027 proposed budget that our team has been pretty much sharing with not only our board, our workshops, a number of our committees. So this is our first public-facing public hearing where you get to hear a presentation on the 2026-2027 proposed budget. So we welcome any questions or comments after the presentation that our team should be able to answer. If not, we can always follow up with you. This presentation recording will be placed on the project webpage as well and sent out to those that are interested in viewing it if they missed this. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jaden, who's going to run the rest of the show. Jaden?
All right, good morning. Thanks, David. Jaden Sanga, I am controller for VTA and will be running you through VTA's fiscal year 26-27 biannual budget. I guess, like David said, this has gone to board workshop. Board has seen this. It's gone to a few committees, and it'll be going to the board workshop for the board meeting for adoption the first week of June. So if you go to first slide, please. Next slide. All right, so the agenda for today's presentation is to look at our fiscal year 26-27 revenues and expenditure budget. We'll look at VTA's outlook of our revenues and also overall economic outlook for the regional, state, and national economies. We'll look at our 10-year projections for VTA for our revenues and expenses and the position that we're going to be in as we look ahead for the agency. We'll look at VTA's capital program and our capital budget that's partially funded through the Transit Operating Fund and also some mega projects that are funded through other funds like 2000 Measure A. And then we'll look at other funds and programs that VTA functions. And at the end, we'll be happy to answer any questions. Next slide. All right, so the fiscal year 2026-27, this slide here shows how our budget for the next 2 years aligns with the business plan for the agency. And we have 4 priorities that are part of our business plan that includes fast, frequent, and reliable transit network, our project and program delivery excellence, mobility solutions through partnerships, and workforce development and well-being. The budget, as we're looking to setting the course for the next 2 years, these were the priorities that were taken into consideration and prioritized as part of the budget. Again, the goal here is to work towards a transit ecosystem that serves the evolving needs of the community while also being fiscally sustainable and also fiscally prudent with our approach as we look ahead for the agency's finances. Next slide. All right, so as you can all see, a lot of the cities and counties are going through some of the economic challenges, and that's related to the regional, state, and national economic outlook and some of the pressures that we are seeing on our sales tax revenues. As explained to the board, VTA is a heavily sales tax dependent agency. Over 80% of our revenues for the transit fund come from sales tax. So as we're developing the budget, it's our goal to really be fiscally disciplined as we are seeing pressures on our sales tax revenues and really introducing some targeted cost measures that will limit the cost and the cost increases for the next 2 years. Our commitment is to fiscal prudence and really managing our resources, our limited resources and our reserves to maintain fiscal flexibility for the agency as we look ahead. Next slide. Here we have some broader economic concerns for the agency. The first one here is the slowdown in the consumer and business spending. In Santa Clara County, there's generally 5 sales tax categories that generate the sales tax revenues for cities, counties, and transit agencies, with consumer and business spending being the top 2 categories. So of all the revenues that come in through the form of sales tax, 60% of those sales tax come through retail spending and business spending in the county. Those are the 2 categories that are seeing a decline. Historically, looking at last year and the year before, there's been declines, and we're kind of seeing those declines really growing in the past few quarters. And likely that trend will continue into fiscal 26 and 27. And that has been one of the challenges that we're grappling with, to ensuring that our revenues are at a level where they are and our expenses are not really increasing too much, so our deficit is manageable for the next 2 years as we look ahead. There's also concerns with the tariffs and federal policy landscape. Again, at the federal level, there's tariffs that are being introduced for different countries and how that will really impact the business growth and business spending in Santa Clara County. That's the concerns that we've looked at and incorporated as a concern in our budget expenditures for the next 2 years. And finally, we have recessionary pressures that we are seeing. Over half the economists in the US are predicting a recession in fiscal year 2026. So if that happened, obviously that will impact the consumer and business spending in the county. That will in turn affect our revenue growth and our collections of sales tax revenues. So all these categories are closely watched and were the priorities that we considered as part of the development for the budget for the next 2 years. Next slide. This slide here shows our economic outlook for our 1976 half-cent sales tax. This is our primary funding source for the transit fund, the half-cent sales tax in Santa Clara County. The revenues come to VTA and it funds the bus and light rail operations primarily. Like I said, it's the main revenue source. And if you can look at the last three columns on this chart, fiscal year 2024-25, that's the current fiscal year that we are in. The projected revenue receipts for sales tax is $272 million. Just for context, we budgeted $290 million for fiscal year 25. So there's that delta decrease of $18 to $20 million in decline in the sales tax collections that we are seeing in the current fiscal year. And that trend from the forecast that we are incorporating in the budget for the next 2 years for the revenues is what's likely will the sales tax revenue growth will be very stagnant for 2026 with a 50 basis points increase and roughly 2% increase in fiscal year 27. Again, that growth in sales tax is not enough to keep pace with our growth in our expenditures for the transit fund, which obviously then brings about that gap that we're seeing in our revenue collections for the next 2 years and our expenditure line items that in turn is then generating that deficit that we're going to be seeing for the next 2 years. Next slide. All right, so here we have is our long-range financial plan. It's a 10-year plan that we maintain at the agency. It takes into account a lot of volatility in our sales taxes accounted for, some recession expectations that are built into this 10-year plan for the agency. The first two columns that you see, fiscal year 26 and 27, those are our proposed budget for the revenues and expenses. And then you see in the red, those are the deficit that you were showing. So we're recommending a deficit budget for the next 2 years, $1 million deficit in 26 and a $15 million deficit in 2027. That is with some of the cost saving measures that we introduced and put in place. And then if you look at fiscal year 2028, the deficit really grows to $92 million. And again, it goes up to the range of $133 to $140 million by the end of fiscal year 2035. And as you all know, if there's a deficit in our transit operating budget, then that affects our reserves that we have at the agency, our operating reserves. And that's what's shown in the bottom two lines. We are starting fiscal 26 with $226 million in operating reserves. And every year we run a deficit, that number gets reduced by that deficit amount. So you see that 226 being reduced to 225 and then 210, 117. And what we're showing here is by the end of 2029, we would have spent all of our reserves and be in some level of a fiscal cliff situation for the agency. Again, this is taking into account revenue growth and sales tax growth that's not high enough to keep pace with the expenditures. Things could change. Revenue for the sales tax could improve, and that will, present this information to be much different than what we're showing today. And that goes to show the need for us to really keep an eye on sales tax trends and putting additional cost saving measures for the agency to make sure that we're not running into a fiscal cliff and we're sustainable for the future to come. Next slide. This slide here shows some of the cost saving measures or targeted measures that we've introduced and instituted for the fiscal year 26-27. Number one is limiting our budget increases. Historically, when we start our budget process, we put out feelers for all the divisions, departments on what additional monies they need and asks that they have for additional work they want to bring on in their divisions. And all those requests are then, vetted and really see what needs to be incorporated into the budget. What we're limiting for the next 2 years is limiting our non-labor budget increases to a 5% increase from the fiscal year 2025 adopted budget. So that 5% increase is minimal, is only enough to keep pace with some of the cost escalations that are built into the contract due to inflation and things like that. We are not entertaining any other additional asks that came in. given the fact that we can't afford them. So we're limiting that increase to 5% for the non-labor increased budget for the agency for next 2 years. Second part here is our zero capital funding allocation for transit from the transit fund for the next 2 years. For the capital ecosystem for transit agency for VTA, we generally historically transfer roughly $40 to $50 million from the transit operating budget to the capital to fund all the local capital projects. That is not what we're doing for the next 2 years. So there's zero allocation from transit fund to the capital ecosystem. With that being said, we're still funding 32 capital project, and that money will be taken from the capital reserve that's set aside for the agencies. We're dipping into the reserves for the capital projects that absolutely need to be funded, that also have external monies secured, grants and from state and federal grants that are part of those capital projects. So we're funding roughly 32 projects with the $61.3 million in allocation from the capital reserve. And next thing is hiring pause and no new FTEs for the agency. We are not adding any new positions for the agency for the next 2 years. And we've also instituted a hiring pause for VTA at the beginning of April. And that hiring pause is basically for all the vacancies that come about through attrition will not be filled. And the goal there is to get our vacancy rate at the agency from 8%, and that's our current vacancy rate today, to a 20% vacancy for the agency and use those salary savings for the next 2 years to balance the budget. So like I said, it's 8% is where we are for the vacancies, our goal, and what we're budgeting into the next 2 years is a 20% vacancy rate for the agency. Next slide. This slide here shows a scenario. This is not the recommended budget. This shows a scenario as to what the picture would look like, financial picture would look like if we did not do some of the targeted cost measures that I am talking about, including the 20% vacancy rate, what our deficit would look like. So the last two columns that you see here for fiscal year 2026, with the revenues at $602 million for the transit fund, with the expenses being at 463, and these are labor cost and labor and benefits, and then non-labor expenditure being at 176, and the deficit being at $37.7 million in 26 and 53.6 in 2027. This shows that if we didn't do these cost measures, cost containment measures, our deficit would be much bigger than what we're recommending today. Next slide. This here shows, it just puts numbers to that 20% number we talked about for the vacancy savings. So the left-hand side, it shows 8% vacancy rate at the agency generally saves roughly $24.6 million in salary savings. The goal and what we're budgeting in our budget for the 26 and 27, both years, is again a 20% vacancy rate or a $62.1 million in salary savings. Those salary savings are budgeted for the next 2 years. And again, the goal is to get to that number through the hiring freeze that we talked about. And if we're not able to get to the 20%, then we will be supplementing the savings that we need through things like furloughs at the agency. And the right-hand side of the bars that you see there shows what 1 day a month for 12 months furlough would generate roughly $5.5 million in savings for the agency. So again, this goes to show what we're budgeting, $62.1 million in salary savings, and what our plan is to achieve that through a combination of keeping the vacancy, the hiring freeze in place for VTA, and also potentially doing furlough days, 1 or 2 a month, or potentially 3 a month, depending on what the need is, and balancing the budget through these measures. Next slide. This here is a scenario. Again, this is not what we're budgeting into our budget, but we looked at this scenario, and this shows if we reduced our non-labor budget for all the division all across the agency, what that would generate in savings. And we, on this conversation here, we don't think this is a viable avenue for us to really explore, given that we have a lot of contracts with all the divisions and departments that obviously heavily rely on the non-labor budget for the agency, and those contracts are already in place and there's CPI escalations that are built in. So if we did do this, introduce a 5% reduction to the non-labor budget, it would generate roughly $6 to $7 million in savings, but we would then need to also renegotiate over 600 contracts throughout the agency, with limiting the scope and then, having some level of contract amendments in place because now we don't have the money to pay for those contracts. We wanted to show this to the board and also the public here that this is not something that we're putting into the budget. Only the cost measures that we are budgeting in are the 20% vacancy rate, zero allocation to capital, and 5% increase for the non-labor budget. Next slide. This here is a quick overview of what the budget looks like for the next 2 years. Again, revenues at 602 million and 597 respectively for the next 2 years, with the expenses with all the cost containment measures baked in at 602 and 612 for the next 2 years, with a deficit of $868,000 in fiscal year 2026 and $14.9 million for fiscal year 2027. Next slide. As mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we also manage a lot of other programs and other funds throughout the agency. So what we've talked about so far is our VTA Transit Operating Fund that funds the bus and light rail maintenance and operations. We also have our CMP, which is a relatively small fund at $7.4 million. So on this slide here, we show you all the programs and all the other funds and where they are budgeted. Again, it also includes our 2000 Measure A, 2008 Measure B, and 2016 Measure B programs that VTA manages. Next slide. These are some of the revenue categories for the agency. Again, a granular detail of what's making up of that $602 million in revenue that we'll be generating for fiscal 26 and 597 in fiscal 27. Again, a small category is fares. It's roughly 6 to 7% of our total revenues generated at the agency at $30 million and $30.9 million for 27. All the rest of the categories are sales tax driven. 1976 half-cent sales tax. And if you compare the numbers for the last two columns to fiscal year 2025 budgeted, you would see that decline that we are projecting for the next 2 years. Our TDA revenues as a Transportation Development Act is the revenue that comes from the state through MTC, also sales tax driven, and the revenues are budgeted there. STA is our gas tax that again also comes from state to MTC, and the revenues are there. 2000 Measure A subsidy and 2016 Measure B subsidy is listed there. And again, all of these sales tax driven resources there are showing a decline for the next 2 years. Next slide. Next, we have as a transit fund expenses. Again, the detail of the line items, what makes up the $602 million in expenditures for fiscal year 26. Service delivery at $580 million. This includes our labor and non-labor budget for the transit fund. We also have regional transit services. This includes our paratransit and other regional transit services that VTA provides, and there's that budget there. We have reimbursements. This is staff hours that are charged out to capital projects, and they come back as a source of revenue for the transit fund. We have debt service that's listed there. And finally, the transfer to capital reserve. And this is, again, historically, if you look, we've transferred roughly $40 million from the transit operating fund to the capital ecosystem. And we're not projecting that for 26, 27. As mentioned, we are going to be using our capital reserve to fund the 32 capital project at the amount of $61.9 million. Next slide. All right, so with that, I'll pass it on to Danny to talk briefly about the VTA capital program, and then we'll take questions at the end.
Thanks, Jaden. Hi, everybody. My name is Danny Nguyen, the budget manager here at VTA. In this next section, we'll go over the capital budget program at VTA, as well as provide an overview of the other funds and programs that VTA oversees. Next slide. Here is an overview of the capital budget timeline. We started off in September of 2024 with a kickoff of the capital budget request for appropriation for new projects or continuing projects. From there, we gathered a list of requests and reviewed those project appropriation requests internally in the January-February timeframe of 2025. And then we developed a proposed list of projects to provide appropriation for and moved that to the board budget workshop, as well as the capital program committee review in April. From there, we took additional input and provided updates to the list and moved it to review by the Joint Working Group Committee, as well as the A&F Committee. The proposed list was approved and referred to the board for approval, which will occur in the first week of June. Next slide. We're going to focus here on one of the programs, which is the VTA Transit Fund Capital Program. As Jaden mentioned before, the VTA Transit capital projects are funded from a capital reserve fund called the Transit Operations Capital Fund. This fund was established in 2023 by the board, and the intent is to provide local funding for capital projects that utilize the local funding as to fund as a match or as a whole for the project. In prior years, we funded this reserve with transit operating funds by about $40–50 million. In the recommended budget, we are proposing to not fund the Transit Operations Capital Fund to help balance the operating budget. With that said, though, there is a balance of about $192 million in the reserve capital fund. In this current cycle, we received about 127 project requests, which totaled of about $685 million in appropriation. Of that $685 million, $342 million was requesting VTA local funds. Through the prioritization process that we went through and using the criteria adopted by the board, we are recommending a list of 32 projects for a total appropriation of $240 million, of which $61 million is utilizing VTA local funds. If the recommended list is adopted by the board, the capital reserve fund will have about $130 million remaining for future capital projects. Next slide. This chart here provides an overview of the capital projects that are being recommended for approval and the funding allocations by category. The largest category is the revenue vehicles and equipment at 30% of the appropriation, and this category includes projects such as purchase of electric buses, as well as procurement for the paratransit fleet. Next slide. This slide here is just an overview of the other budgets and programs that VTA oversees. The congestion management program is the VTA serves as the congestion management agency for Santa Clara County. And as a CMA, VTA is responsible for countywide transportation planning and land use coordination. Next, the Silicon Valley Express Lanes. The Express Lanes is a program that aims to provide congestion relief through effective use of the existing roadways. The Transit-Oriented Communities program is for development of projects on VTA-owned properties to help generate development for transit-related activities. The VTB Highway Improvement Program is a regional capital program that pools funding from state and federal sources to help improve transit highways, expressways, and other transportation activities across the county. The 2000 Measure A Transit Improvement Program, it's a voter-approved half-cent sales tax that's dedicated to transit improvements. It's a 30-year measure, and it's earmarked for projects like the BART Silicon Valley Extension and the East Ridge to BART Regional Connector. The 2008 Measure B BART Operating Sales Tax Program, it's a 1/8 cent sales tax with a 30-year lifespan, and it funds the operating, maintenance, and capital needs of the VTA BART Silicon Valley services in the county. And the last one listed is the 2016 Measure B program. It's a half-cent sales tax that provides funding for transit, highways, expressways, and other active transportation projects such as biking and walking. The funds here are allocated on a formula-based distribution. Next slide. Oh, muted, Jaden.
All right, thanks, Danny. So I'll conclude with just a few points that are listed here on this slide. Again, our commitment is to be a sustainable agency for years to come, and there are, again, cost containment measures that are introduced as part of this budget for 26 and 27 that have been well discussed with the board. and they will be again discussed at the board meeting on June 5th. The important piece to note here is, again, the times will be challenging, and there's a lot of watching and seeing what the sales tax trends are in fiscal year 2026, and then recalibrating our strategy on what's needed to really offset the decline of sales tax on cutting the cost for the agency. Again, the 20% vacancy rate is built in, potential furlough days are built in. There's all these cost containment measures again, but if the sales tax starts to improve in 26, then there wouldn't really be a need for us to try to get to that 20% vacancy rate or other measures that are in place. All these things will be recalibrated and really understood as to what we need to do as an agency, so we're not hitting the reserves for fiscal year 26 or 27, and really kind of maintaining the same position for years to come. So we are sustainable in terms of our finances. And that calls for a continued collaborations throughout the agency, through public, continued collaboration with the board, and really help them understand as to where we are. We take our budget updates to the board every quarter and help them understand as to what the real actual revenues are coming in for sales tax versus what we projected. And that really paints the picture of the position that we are in and how we're navigating the challenges. Again, as mentioned at the beginning of this presentation has been taken to the budget workshop on April 25th. It's gone to the CPC committee for review of the capital projects that are recommended, the 32 capital projects, and has been approved and recommended for the board. The Joint Advisory Committee workshop has reviewed this presentation with all of the advisory committees. We've taken this to our Administrative and Finance Committee on May 15th, and it's been recommended for approval to move forward to board for adoption. It's putting in front of you for a community meeting on May 30th. And again, like I said, it'll be going to the board on June 5th for board of directors meeting, and we'll have a healthy discussion there on all the components of this presentation. With that, I will stop and take any questions from the attendees of this meeting. Maybe if you can stop sharing the screen, that'd be great. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaden. Yes, if we have any questions, go ahead and raise your hand. I'll unmute you, and then our panelists be able to respond. So Eugene, go ahead and go ahead, Eugene.
Morning, David. Morning, staff. Eugene Bradley, Silicon Valley Transit users. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Couple of things, though, that I believe is going to help folks understand this budget, not just board members, also the general public. One of which would be like a pie chart showing where transit operations project money for transit operations as well as transit capital projects, in addition to highway projects, comes from. And with that, particularly with the sales taxes, a reminder to folks that at least the sales taxes, 2000, 2008, and 2016 were what voters originally approved. So this way, there's no misconstruing about whether or not such sales taxes were approved by were formally voted on by the board, and whether or not the ones that were approved by the voters, ultimately their managers. So just as a couple of suggestions on that and a question on that to make it easier for board members to approve and for the general public to understand VTA's financial situation right now.
Yeah, no, thank you, Eugene, for the recommendation. We can certainly add a pie chart for the revenues for the transit fund, and also maybe look at adding that for all the other funds. I think it'd be helpful. Thanks for that recommendation.
Go ahead, Eugene, with your follow-up.
Okay, just one more thing. Also, a breakdown of spending regarding transit operations and capital projects. And just one more quick question, given what's been going on in Washington and the obvious current administration's obvious hatred of California, is VTA still receiving federal funding for transit operations, particularly the FTA 5307 transit dollars at this time?
We are roughly, I believe it's less than $10 million that was received in fiscal year 2025. So that's strictly for the operations of the transit fund. But again, there's federal monies that are tied to the capital projects like BSV2, which is much bigger. I think in billions, 4.5 or $5 billion that's allocated there. but that number is relatively small when it comes to the transit operations for bus and light rail.
Right. And just one last thought. Like I said, that pie chart that reflects the federal money versus local sales taxes approved by voters would clarify things much easier for the board and for the general public to understand VT's fiscal situation. Thank you for allowing me to speak and give my questions and concerns.
Absolutely. If we have any other questions from our audience, go ahead and raise your hand. I'll unmute you and you can address our panelists. And as people are considering asking questions, just a reminder, this recording of this hearing will be provided on the project webpage. Those that registered to attend this event will get a link to the recording as well. And as of right now, it doesn't look like anyone has any questions. And so with that, Danny, Jaden, I want to thank you very much for taking the time on Friday to provide this presentation to the public that we will send out so people can review it. And want to remind everybody that this presentation will be provided one last time at our next board meeting, which is, if I'm right, June 5th. So public, if they'd like to provide one last comment during that period, that would be your opportunity and time. So Dan, Jaden, audience, thank you very much. Have a great weekend, and we will see each other soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.